October 17, 1944. The skies above Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. Lieutenant Commander Roger Hedrick, flying an F4U 1D Corsair from Marine Fighter Squadron 323, rolls inverted at 18,000 feet and pulls through into a steep dive. Below him, a formation of Mitsubishi A6 M0 fighters circles at 12,000 feet, completely unaware of the danger screaming down from above at over 400 miles per hour. The engagement lasts 45 seconds. Hedrick's 650 caliber Browning machine guns tear through 2 zeros before the formation even realizes they're under attack. By the time Japanese pilots react, Hedrick's Corsair is already climbing back through 15,000 feet, using the massive power of its Pratt Whitney R2800 engine to regain altitude faster than any pursuing Zero can follow. The Japanese flight leader radios a warning to his remaining pilots, but it's already too late. Another Corsair piloted by Captain Kenneth Walsh dives from 22,000 feet, destroys a third Zero, and climbs away before anyone can respond. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern that repeated itself hundreds of times across the Pacific theater during the final year of the war, and it forced Japanese naval aviation to confront a brutal reality. The chance-vought F4U Corsair wasn't just faster than their fighters. It wasn't just more heavily armed. It possessed a specific performance advantage that made it nearly invincible when flown properly. Below 20,000 feet, in the thick air where most Pacific combat occurred, the Corsair could outclimb, outdive, and out-accelerate every Japanese fighter in service. And Japanese pilots had no counter for it. The tactical warning that eventually circulated through Japanese naval aviation units was explicit and desperate. Do not engage F4U below 20,000 feet, maintain altitude advantage, or disengage entirely. This wasn't a suggestion. It was an acknowledgement that Japanese fighters had lost control of low and medium altitude combat completely. The story of how American pilots exploited the Corsair's low-altitude superiority and how Japanese aviation struggled to counter it reveals the intersection of engineering, tactics, and industrial capability that defined the Pacific Air War's final chapter. The Corsair's development began in 1938, years before anyone imagined the specific tactical challenges of Pacific combat. The United States Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics issued a request for proposals seeking a fighter capable of exceeding 400 miles per hour in level flight. This specification was revolutionary for its time. Most contemporary fighters struggled to reach 350 miles per hour. The Navy wasn't just asking for incremental improvement. They were demanding a quantum leap in performance. Chance Vought Aircraft Division, based in Stratford, Connecticut, responded with a design philosophy that would define the Corsair's character. Chief designer Rex Beisel and his engineering team decided to build their fighter around the most powerful engine available. The Pratt Whitney R2800 Double Wasp was an 18-cylinder, 2-row radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. This was nearly double the power output of engines in most existing fighters. But massive power created massive challenges. To efficiently convert 2,000 horsepower into thrust, Beisel's team needed an enormous propeller. They designed a 13-foot, 4-inch diameter Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller, the largest ever fitted to a single-engine fighter. This created an immediate engineering problem. How do you provide ground clearance for such a massive propeller while maintaining the structural efficiency necessary for carrier operations? Conventional straight wings would require impossibly long landing gear, creating unacceptable weight and structural complications. The solution became the Corsair's most distinctive feature and inadvertently contributed to its low-altitude performance advantages. Beisel designed an inverted gull wing configuration. The wings angled sharply downward from the fuselage before leveling out horizontally. This created the distinctive bent wing silhouette that made the Corsair instantly recognizable. The inverted gull wing solved multiple problems simultaneously. It provided propeller clearance with relatively short, sturdy landing gear. It positioned the main landing gear attachment points at the wing's strongest structural section, and critically, it optimized airflow where the wing met the fuselage, reducing drag in exactly the region where interference drag was typically highest. This drag reduction wasn't just about top speed. It affected the entire performance envelope, particularly acceleration and climb rate at lower altitudes where air density was greatest. The prototype XF4U first flew on May 29, 1940, piloted by Lyman Bullard Jr., Vort's chief test pilot. The aircraft's performance immediately validated Beisel's radical design choices. On October 1, 1940, during a test flight between Stratford and Hartford, the XF4U achieved a ground speed of 405 miles per hour with tailwind assistance. This made headlines across aviation publications. But the real story was the aircraft's sustained performance characteristics, particularly at altitudes below 20,000 feet, where the supercharger's first stage provided optimal power delivery. The Corsair's power plant was the key to understanding its low-altitude dominance. The R2800 Double Wasp featured a two-stage, two-speed supercharger system designed to maintain power output as altitude increased. The first supercharger stage operated at lower altitudes, compressing intake air to maintain optimal fuel-air mixture as atmospheric pressure decreased. The second stage engaged at higher altitudes, providing additional compression to compensate for thinner air. This system meant the Corsair had essentially two different performance profiles. Below the supercharger's critical altitude, approximately 18,000 to 20,000 feet, depending on specific engine variants and settings, the engine produced tremendous power. The thick air at these altitudes provided excellent propeller efficiency, converting that power into thrust with maximum effectiveness. Above 20,000 feet, performance remained strong, but the advantage over Japanese fighters diminished as thinner air reduced propeller efficiency for all aircraft. The tactical implications were profound. Most Pacific air combat occurred between sea level and 15,000 feet. Carrier-launched strikes approached targets at medium altitudes. Combat air patrols orbited at 10 to 15,000 feet. Ground attack missions operated below 5,000 feet. These were exactly the altitudes where the Corsair's power advantage was most pronounced. A Corsair at 10,000 feet could accelerate from cruising speed to maximum speed faster than any Japanese fighter. It could climb at over 3,000 feet per minute, significantly faster than a Zero's 2,500 feet per minute maximum climb rate. Production F4U Corsairs began reaching Marine Corps squadrons in late 1942. Marine Fighter Squadron 124, VMF 124, received the first combat-ready aircraft and deployed to Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in February 1943. The Corsair's combat debut was inauspicious and bloody. On February 14, 1943, during an engagement that pilots grimly remembered as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, mixed American formations, including Corsairs, suffered severe losses to experienced Japanese pilots, but American aviators learned quickly. Lieutenant Ken Walsh, who would become the first Corsair pilot to receive the Medal of Honor, developed tactics that exploited the aircraft's strengths while avoiding its weaknesses. The Corsair couldn't outturn a Zero in traditional dogfighting. The Japanese fighter's light weight and large wing area gave it a turning radius that no American fighter could match. But the Corsair didn't need to turn with Zeros. It could do something far more effective. Walsh's tactics became doctrine throughout Marine Corps aviation. Maintain altitude and speed when engaging enemy aircraft, dive from above using gravity and engine power to achieve tremendous closing speed. Make a single high-speed firing pass with the Corsair's 650 caliber Browning machine guns. Then, and this was critical, don't turn to pursue. Instead, use your diving speed to climb back to altitude, extending away from enemy fighters that couldn't match your climb rate. By the time enemy pilots recovered from the initial shock and attempted pursuit, the Corsair would already be 2,000 or 3,000 feet higher, repositioning for another attack. This became known as boom and zoom tactics, and the Corsair was the perfect platform for executing them. The massive R2800 engine meant a Corsair pilot could enter a climb from level flight at 300 miles per hour and maintain a sustained climb at over 200 miles per hour. A Zero attempting the same maneuver would see its airspeed bleed off more rapidly, forcing the pilot to either accept a dangerously slow climb or level off and abandon pursuit. By mid-1943, Corsair squadrons in the Solomon Islands were systematically destroying Japanese air power through disciplined application of energy tactics. Marine pilots racked up impressive kill ratios, but more importantly, they were forcing Japanese aviation to adapt their entire tactical doctrine. Japanese pilots who had spent 2 years dominating Pacific skies through aggressive maneuvering combat now faced an opponent that simply refused to fight on Japanese terms. Japanese intelligence officers compiled reports from surviving pilots after each engagement. These reports, later captured by Allied forces and translated during the post-war occupation, revealed growing concern about the bent-wing American fighter. Pilots consistently mentioned the Corsair's ability to accelerate rapidly at low altitude, to climb away from pursuing Zeros, and to control the terms of engagement completely. One report from the 253rd Kokutai, dated August 1943, stated that American pilots demonstrated improved tactical discipline, refusing turning combat, and exploiting superior speed in vertical maneuvers. The psychological impact was significant. Japanese pilots had built their confidence on 2 years of victories achieved through superior maneuverability and aggressive spirit. Now they faced an opponent that invalidated maneuverability as a decisive advantage. The Corsair pilot who maintained discipline and stuck to energy tactics was nearly invincible. Japanese pilots found themselves in the impossible position of chasing an enemy that could simply climb away whenever combat became unfavorable. By late 1943, the Corsair was spreading across the Pacific theater. Navy squadrons aboard carriers adopted the fighter, despite initial concerns about its difficult landing characteristics. The long nose created visibility problems during carrier approaches, and the stiff landing gear tended to bounce on carrier decks. But the aircraft's combat effectiveness outweighed these handling quirks. Pilots adapted their technique, and soon Navy Corsair squadrons were achieving kill ratios comparable to their Marine Corps counterparts. The Corsair's armament made it devastating in the dive attacks that characterized boom and zoom tactics. 6 ANM, 250 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, delivered overwhelming firepower. The 4 inboard guns carried 400 rounds each, while the 2 outboard guns carried 375 rounds each, for a total ammunition load of 2,350 rounds. At the Corsair's typical firing rate of 800 rounds per minute per gun, this provided approximately 29 seconds of firing time. But combat engagements rarely required sustained fire. Corsair pilots learned to fire in short, precise bursts during high-speed diving passes. The combined muzzle velocity of 650 caliber guns, each firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds at 2,800 feet per second, was absolutely destructive. A 2-second burst put 12 rounds from each gun into the target area, 72 heavy bullets arriving almost simultaneously. No Japanese fighter's light structure could withstand this kind of concentrated firepower. The Corsair's ruggedness gave pilots confidence during aggressive diving attacks. The airframe was built like a heavyweight fighter, with heavy-gauge aluminum alloy construction and redundant structural load paths. The skin was thicker than Japanese fighters, and internal framework was substantially stronger. Armor plating behind the pilot's seat, thick bulletproof glass behind the windscreen, and self-sealing fuel tanks provided protection that saved countless American lives. Pilots knew they could absorb battle damage and still make it home. This psychological advantage translated to tactical aggressiveness. A Corsair pilot could commit fully to a diving attack, confident that even if enemy fire struck his aircraft, he had a reasonable chance of survival. Japanese pilots in lightly built Zeros lacked this assurance. They knew a single 50 caliber hit in the wrong location could tear their aircraft apart or ignite unprotected fuel tanks. By early 44. Japanese naval aviation faced a crisis. Their most experienced pilots, the veterans with hundreds of combat hours and refined tactical instincts, were dead or physically exhausted. The pre-war training system that had produced superbly skilled aviators had collapsed under wartime demands. New pilots arrived at operational squadrons with minimal flight time and almost no gunnery or tactical training. These barely trained aviators faced American pilots with extensive training, superior aircraft, and tactical doctrines refined through 2 years of combat experience. Japanese commanders recognized they couldn't win traditional air combat anymore. The combination of American numerical superiority, better aircraft, and systematic tactics was insurmountable. They needed ways to minimize losses while still contesting American air superiority. This led to the issuance of explicit tactical directives that amounted to acknowledgements of Japanese inferiority. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The tactical bulletin that circulated through Japanese naval aviation units in early to mid-1944 was remarkably specific. Translated intercepts captured by Allied signals intelligence revealed the depth of Japanese concern about the Corsairs' low-altitude performance. The directive instructed pilots to avoid engaging F4U aircraft below 20,000 feet unless they held decisive altitude advantage of at least 5,000 feet or numerical superiority of at least 3-1. Even then, the directive emphasized that engagement should consist of single high-speed passes, followed by immediate disengagement. Under no circumstances should pilots attempt prolonged combat with Corsairs at low or medium altitude. The admission was extraordinary. Japanese naval aviation, which had opened the war with Pearl Harbor and devastated Allied air forces across Asia and the Pacific, was now telling its pilots to avoid combat with a specific American fighter under the most common combat conditions. This wasn't tactical flexibility. It was acceptance of technological defeat. The reasoning behind the altitude restriction was sound aerodynamics and engineering. Japanese fighters, particularly the Zero, were optimized for a different performance envelope. The Zero's Nakajima Sakaya radial engine produced only 940 horsepower, less than half the Corsair's output. To compensate, Mitsubishi's designers had created an extremely lightweight airframe. The Zero weighed only 5,213 pounds fully loaded, compared to the Corsair's 12,000 pounds. This lightweight gave the Zero excellent maneuverability and reasonable performance at its engine's power output. But it meant the aircraft had low wing loading, the ratio of weight to wing area. Low wing loading was advantageous for tight turns and climbing at slower speeds. But it became a disadvantage during high-speed maneuvering, particularly in diving and zoom climbing. The Zero's light wing loading meant it accelerated more slowly in dives and bled energy more rapidly during climbs from high-speed entry conditions. The Corsair, by contrast, had high wing loading. Its 12,000-pound weight was distributed across relatively smaller wing area. This made it less maneuverable at low speeds but gave it tremendous advantages in high-speed flight. In a dive, the Corsair's weight helped it accelerate rapidly. The massive engine's power, combined with gravitational acceleration, produced closing speeds that Japanese pilots found almost impossible to evade. In zoom climbs, converting diving speed into altitude, the Corsair's momentum carried it upward while the engine continued producing full power. At altitudes below 20,000 feet, where air density was highest, these advantages were most pronounced. The thick air provided maximum resistance for the Corsair's large propeller to work against, converting engine power into thrust with peak efficiency. The supercharger's first stage maintained optimal manifold pressure, keeping the engine producing its rated horsepower. A Corsair at 10,000 feet, diving from 15,000 feet, could reach speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour and then convert that speed into a climb back through 20,000 feet. A Zero attempting to pursue faced impossible physics. Its lighter weight meant less gravitational advantage during the dive. Its smaller engine produced less power to sustain the climb. Its lower wing loading meant higher drag relative to weight during high-speed flight. A Zero pilot watching a Corsair climb away after an attack wasn't witnessing pilot skill. He was watching fundamental aerodynamic and engineering advantages that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome. Japanese test pilots who examined captured Corsairs during the war confirmed what combat pilots reported. The captured aircraft, salvaged from forced landings or recovered from island airfields, underwent systematic evaluation at facilities like Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal. Japanese engineers marveled at the R-2800 engine's sophisticated construction, the rugged airframe design, and the overall quality of American manufacturing. But what truly impressed them was how all these elements combined to create specific performance advantages at tactically critical altitudes. Test flights of the captured Corsair, when possible given the aircraft's condition, demonstrated climb rates and acceleration that Japanese fighters simply couldn't match below 20,000 feet. Japanese engineers calculated that developing an equivalent fighter would require not just a more powerful engine, but entirely new manufacturing techniques, higher quality materials, and production methods Japan's war-strained industry couldn't provide. The technological gap wasn't something that could be closed through design, cleverness, or pilot training. It required industrial capabilities Japan no longer possessed. American pilots exploited the Corsair's low-altitude dominance with increasingly sophisticated tactics. Squadron commanders like Major Gregory Boyington, leading VMF 214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron, developed coordinated attack patterns that maximized the Corsair's strengths. Boyington's tactics involved staggering his fighters at different altitudes between 15 and 25,000 feet. When Japanese formations appeared below, Corsairs would attack in sequence from different directions and altitudes, creating continuous threats that Japanese pilots couldn't effectively counter. The overlapping attacks prevented Japanese pilots from establishing any coherent defensive formation. When they turned to face one diving Corsair, another attacked from a different angle. When they attempted to climb after a departing attacker, they exposed themselves to follow-on attacks from Corsairs at higher altitude. The tactics required discipline and coordination, but they were devastatingly effective. Boyington himself achieved 28 confirmed victories using these methods, becoming one of the Marine Corps' top aces. Navy Corsair squadrons aboard carriers developed similar coordinated tactics. Commander David McCampbell, who would finish the war as the Navy's top ace with 34 victories, led Fighting Squadron 15 aboard USS Essex. McCampbell's tactical philosophy emphasized patience and altitude discipline. His pilots maintained combat air patrol stations at 20,000 to 25,000 feet, even when this meant watching Japanese aircraft pass below them apparently unmolested. The temptation to dive immediately was enormous for aggressive young pilots, but McCampbell insisted on waiting for optimal attack conditions. When McCampbell's division did attack, they did so with overwhelming advantage. Diving from 25,000 feet toward targets at 12,000 feet gave them a 13,000-foot energy advantage. The Corsairs would reach speeds approaching 500 miles per hour during the dive, making them nearly impossible to track for defensive fire. After firing passes tore through Japanese formations, McCampbell's pilots would climb back through 20,000 feet, extending several miles away while regaining altitude advantage. Japanese pilots attempting to pursue found themselves in futile chases, watching their tormentors climb away while their own aircraft struggled through thinner air at maximum climb rates that still couldn't close the gap. The June 19th to 20th, 1944 Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated the culmination of these tactics on a massive scale. Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, deployed 15 carriers with 475 Hellcats and 76 Corsairs among its fighter complement. When Japanese Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched waves of aircraft from his carrier fleet, American radar detected the incoming strikes at ranges exceeding 100 miles, providing ample time for fighters to climb to optimal interception altitude. Corsair pilots from Marine squadrons aboard escort carriers and from land bases on Guam positioned themselves in the 20 to 25,000 foot altitude range. When Japanese formations appeared below at 12 to 18,000 feet, American fighters held every possible advantage. They had altitude, radar vectors providing perfect positioning, numerical superiority, and aircraft optimized for exactly this type of combat. The engagements that followed became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and Corsairs contributed significantly to the slaughter. Lieutenant Philip DeLong, flying a Corsair from Marine Fighting Squadron 216 aboard USS Wasp, intercepted a CITES intercept formation of Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers with 0 escorts at 14,000 feet. DeLong's division of 4 Corsairs dove from 22,000 feet, destroyed 3 Judys in the initial pass, Zoom climbed back to altitude, and repeated the attack pattern twice more before Japanese fighters could mount any coordinated response. By the time 0 pilots positioned themselves to engage, DeLong's Corsairs were already repositioning at 25,000 feet for additional attacks. The entire engagement lasted less than 10 minutes and resulted in 7 Japanese aircraft destroyed for 0 American losses. This pattern repeated throughout the 2-day battle. Japanese pilots, following their tactical directives, tried to maintain altitude advantage, but American radar-directed intercepts consistently positioned fighters above incoming strikes. When Japanese pilots did attempt to engage Corsairs at low altitude, the results were predictable and fatal. The few instances where Japanese fighters successfully bounced, Corsairs typically involved surprise attacks on aircraft already engaged with other targets or attacking ground installations. One-on-one combat between alert pilots in comparable energy states almost invariably favored the Corsair below 20,000 feet. Japanese after-action reports from the Philippine Sea battle, captured and translated after the war, revealed the depth of Japanese frustration. Pilots reported that American fighters refused close combat and exploited speed advantages to control engagement terms completely. One report noted that pursuit of retiring American fighters was futile, as they climbed away at rates Japanese aircraft could not match. Another report stated that combat below 20,000 feet against the bent-wing fighter should be avoided entirely unless attacking damaged or unaware aircraft. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was corrosive. They were trained in aggressive tactics and offensive spirit, concepts central to Japanese military culture. Being ordered to avoid combat under most conditions contradicted everything their training had emphasized. Some pilots, particularly younger ones with minimal experience, ignored the tactical directives and engaged Corsairs anyway. They died maintaining their honor, but their deaths accomplished nothing except adding to American victory tallies. More experienced pilots understood the cold reality. Warrant Officer Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces with over 60 confirmed victories, described encounters with Corsairs in his post-war memoir. Sakai was an exceptional pilot who survived the entire war through a combination of skill, experience, and tactical judgment. He stated that when encountering Corsairs at low or medium altitude, he would only engage if he held significant positional advantage and could execute a single firing pass with immediate disengagement. Under no circumstances would he accept prolonged combat or attempt to pursue climbing Corsairs. Sakai's tactical assessment was brutally pragmatic. He recognized that pilot skill mattered, but it couldn't overcome fundamental performance disadvantages. A superior pilot in an inferior aircraft could survive through caution and selective engagement, but he couldn't achieve decisive victories against competent opponents in superior aircraft. Sakai's survival through thousands of combat hours testified to his judgment, but his acknowledgement that he avoided Corsair engagements whenever possible revealed how completely American fighters dominated the tactical environment by 1944. The Corsair's ground attack capabilities further exploited its low-altitude performance advantages. By mid-1944, Corsairs routinely carried external ordnance, 1,000-pound bombs on centerline racks, 500-pound bombs on wing pylons, or 8 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets. These external stores increased drag and reduced performance, but the Corsair's power reserve was so substantial that it remained effective even when configured for ground attack. During the Okinawa campaign from April through June 1945, Corsairs flew thousands of close air support sorties. The aircraft's ability to carry heavy ordnance loads while maintaining performance adequate for air combat made it invaluable for amphibious operations. Corsair pilots would launch from carriers or newly captured airfields, deliver bombs or rockets against Japanese positions, then climb to altitude and provide air cover for subsequent strike packages. The same aircraft could perform ground attack and air superiority missions during a single sortie. Japanese defenders at Okinawa faced relentless Corsair attacks. The aircraft approached ground targets at high speed and low altitude, released ordnance with devastating accuracy, then climbed rapidly away before ground fire could respond effectively. Japanese anti-aircraft batteries tried to track the fast-moving targets, but the Corsair's speed made accurate fire nearly impossible. Even when anti-aircraft shells found their mark, the Corsair's rugged construction often absorbed damage that would destroy lighter Japanese aircraft. Marine and Navy pilots flying close air support at Okinawa developed intimate familiarity with the Corsair's low-altitude handling characteristics. The aircraft remained stable and controllable even during violent maneuvering at treetop height. The powerful engine provided instant response to throttle inputs, allowing pilots to add power and climb away from dangerous situations rapidly. The wide-track landing gear made the aircraft stable during operations from rough forward airstrips. Maintenance crews appreciated the aircraft's reliability and the R2800 engine's tolerance for harsh operating conditions. By the war's final months, Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. The few remaining experienced pilots flew obsolete aircraft with minimal fuel and ammunition. Training programs had collapsed completely. New pilots received almost no instruction before being rushed into combat, where they survived minutes rather than hours. The technological and training advantages American pilots enjoyed were so overwhelming that combat became less a battle than an execution. The tactical directive to avoid engaging Corsairs below 20,000 feet remained in effect, but it was increasingly irrelevant. Japanese pilots rarely had the fuel to reach 20,000 feet. They lacked radar warning to position themselves advantageously. They flew aircraft so worn and poorly maintained that achieving rated performance was impossible. And even when they did everything correctly, American numerical superiority meant they faced multiple opponents simultaneously. The final months of the Pacific War saw Corsairs operating with near impunity across Japanese-controlled territory. Carrier task forces ranged along the Japanese home islands, launching strikes against military installations, shipping, and industrial targets. Corsair pilots flew these missions knowing they held overwhelming advantages in every category. Their aircraft were faster, more heavily armed, more rugged, and more numerous than anything Japan could field. The low-altitude performance that had been decisive in 1943 and 1944 was now simply one advantage among many. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Corsairs' combat record stood among the most impressive of any World War II fighter. American pilots flying Corsairs destroyed 2,140 Japanese aircraft in air-to-air combat, while losing only 189 Corsairs to enemy fighters, an 11-to-1 kill ratio. If ground-based anti-aircraft losses were excluded and only air combat considered, the ratio climbed even higher. These numbers reflected not just the Corsairs' technological superiority, but the entire system of tactics, training, and doctrine that American naval aviation had developed around the aircraft's capabilities. Individual pilot achievements illustrated the Corsairs' effectiveness when properly employed. Major Gregory Boyington's 28 victories made him the Marine Corps' top Corsair ace. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh achieved 21 confirmed kills and received the Medal of Honor for actions in the Solomon Islands. Commander Roger Hedrick finished with 12 victories, all achieved using disciplined boom and zoom tactics that exploited the Corsairs' low-altitude advantages. These aces weren't just talented pilots, they were tacticians who understood energy management, altitude discipline, and how to extract maximum effectiveness from their aircraft's performance envelope. The post-war analysis of Japanese tactical directives provided fascinating insights into how Japan's military leadership responded to technological disadvantage. The captured documents, translated during the American occupation, revealed systematic attempts to counter American advantages through tactical adaptation. The directive regarding Corsair engagement below 20,000 feet was part of a broader pattern of instructions that essentially told Japanese pilots to avoid combat unless they held overwhelming positional or numerical advantage. These directives were militarily sound given the circumstances. Japanese commanders recognized they couldn't win air combat through skill or spirit anymore. The only way to preserve their dwindling forces was through extreme caution and selective engagement, but such tactics guaranteed strategic defeat. An air force that avoids combat except under perfect conditions cedes air superiority completely. American forces could operate freely, knowing Japanese fighters wouldn't contest them effectively. The tactical directives that seemed prudent at the unit level were strategically fatal at the theatre level. The Corsairs' influence extended far beyond World War II. The aircraft remained in production until December 1952, with a total of 12,571 aircraft manufactured. This made it one of the longest production-run fighter aircraft in history. The F4U saw extensive combat during the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, where its low-altitude performance and heavy ordnance capacity made it superbly effective for ground attack missions, even as jet fighters took over air superiority roles. Foreign air forces operated Corsairs for decades. France's Naval flew Corsairs during the Indochina War and later in Algeria. The Royal Navy received over 2,000 Corsairs through Lend-Lease and operated them from carriers in the Atlantic and Pacific. Argentina, Honduras, and El Salvador acquired surplus Corsairs after the war and flew them through the 1960s. The final combat missions by Corsairs occurred during the brief July 1969 football war between Honduras and El Salvador, making it one of the longest-serving combat aircraft in aviation history. The Corsairs' design influenced post-war fighter development significantly. The inverted gull wing configuration appeared in later aircraft designs, though jet propulsion eliminated the propeller clearance problem that originally necessitated it. The emphasis on low-altitude performance and heavy ordnance capacity became standard requirements for ground attack aircraft. The boom and zoom tactics refined by Corsair pilots became foundational doctrine for jet fighters in Korea and Vietnam. Modern fighter pilots still study energy management principles that Corsair pilots pioneered. The concept of trading altitude for speed, using speed to reposition, and controlling engagement terms through superior energy state remains central to air combat maneuvering. The specific numbers have changed with jet performance, but the underlying principles remain identical. A fighter pilot today executing a high-speed attack followed by a zoom climb to regain altitude advantage is employing tactics developed by Corsair pilots over the Pacific 8 decades ago. The human cost of Pacific air combat made the Corsair's protective features as important as its performance. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires that killed countless pilots in earlier fighters. Armor plating and bulletproof glass stopped bullets and shrapnel that would otherwise have been fatal. The robust airframe structure absorbed battle damage and brought pilots home when lighter aircraft would have disintegrated. Navy statistics showed Corsair pilots had significantly higher survival rates than pilots of any previous American carrier fighter. This survival advantage created a positive feedback loop. Experienced pilots survived to fly multiple combat tours, accumulating tactical knowledge and gunnery skill that made them increasingly effective. Japanese pilots, by contrast, faced high attrition rates even when avoiding unfavorable combat. The few who survived long enough to become experienced found themselves flying increasingly obsolete aircraft with declining maintenance and supply support. By late 1944, the experience differential between American and Japanese pilots was so vast that even equivalent aircraft would have resulted in American dominance. Japanese engineers who examined captured Corsairs during and after the war wrote technical reports that revealed their assessment of American aviation technology. These documents, discovered by American occupation forces and now preserved in military archives, expressed professional admiration for the Corsairs' engineering sophistication. Japanese technicians particularly noted the R-2800 engine's advanced supercharger system, which they identified as key to the aircraft's low-altitude performance advantages. The reports acknowledged that Japan lacked the manufacturing precision and metallurgical expertise to produce engines with comparable power output and reliability. Japanese industry could design advanced aircraft on paper, but translating designs into production aircraft with consistent quality was beyond their wartime capabilities. The Corsair represented not just superior engineering, but superior industrial capacity, quality control, and supply chain management. These were advantages that couldn't be overcome through tactical ingenuity or fighting spirit. The story of Japanese tactical response to the Corsair illuminates how military organizations adapt when facing technological disadvantage. The directive to avoid low-altitude engagement was rational given the circumstances. It preserved forces that would otherwise be destroyed in unfavorable combat. But it also represented acknowledgement of defeat. An air force that must avoid combat under most conditions has already lost, strategically, regardless of how well it preserves individual units tactically. Japanese pilots who followed the directive survived longer than those who didn't. But survival without the ability to contest enemy air superiority was ultimately meaningless. American forces operated freely, supporting amphibious operations, attacking shipping, and bombing Japanese positions without effective opposition. The few remaining Japanese fighters that stayed above 20,000 feet to avoid Corsairs were irrelevant to ground troops being strafed by those same Corsairs attacking with impunity at low altitude. The psychological burden on Japanese pilots during the war's final year was immense. They were ordered to avoid combat with superior opponents, conserving their limited resources for a decisive battle that never came. They watched American aircraft operate freely, while being unable to intervene effectively. They knew their comrades were dying in futile engagements while being instructed to avoid similar fates through caution. This created profound demoralization that tactical directives couldn't address. The Corsairs' low-altitude dominance was ultimately a symptom of broader American advantages. The aircraft itself was superbly engineered, but it was also manufactured with precision and quality control. Japanese industry couldn't match. It was maintained by well-trained mechanics with adequate spare parts and tools. It was flown by pilots with extensive training and hundreds of flight hours. It operated from carriers with sophisticated radar direction and coordinated fighter control. Every element of the system reinforced the others, creating overwhelming combat effectiveness. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.